I first watched The Legend of Korra when the show was still airing between 2012 and 2015. I was still a teenager at the time and generally within the target demographic for the show, or so I presume. As a fan of a show as great as Avatar: The Last Airbender, I was of course interested to see where the Avatar universe would go next. So I eagerly watched Season 1 of Korra and went, well that was okay I guess. Now at this point I was basically done with Korra, not because it sucked, but because the show seemed to be obviously over. I couldn't imagine the show continuing since it had ended with such total finality, and more importantly, the show creators Brian Konietzko and Michael DiMartino had explicitly said that The Legend of Korra would be a miniseries. So consider my surprise when I found out things had changed in development and there was a Season 2 of The Legend of Korra. I wouldn't say I was disappointed, but again I was surprised. I didn't really have the terminology at the time to describe why a Season 2 didn't really make sense, aside from the stated goal of the show creators. But now that I'm older and have just rewatched Season 1, I want to give a few thoughts on the show as a whole and why I think The Legend of Korra should have stayed as a miniseries. I've talked before on this channel about the struggles involved in doing satisfying TV show writing as opposed to writing for a movie or book because of the fluctuating and uncertain nature of an industry like television, and fundamentally the lack of knowledge about whether you will have studio support to produce more of your show. But pile onto everything I said there about how difficult it is to write for television with the fact that the series you're writing is the follow-up to arguably the most popular Nickelodeon cartoon of the last 2 decades next to SpongeBob SquarePants. Putting myself in Mike and Brian's shoes, I couldn't imagine trying to write something that would be anywhere near as good as the biggest success of my career. Well, actually, I can't imagine it since the biggest success of my career was a 3-minute YouTube animation with 2 sequels, neither of which were as well received as the first one, which is ironically similar to Mike and Brian's situation, but on a smaller and more poorly written scale. What I'm trying to say is that writing sequels or prequels, particularly to something that was largely self-contained like the amazing 3 seasons of Avatar, isn't easy. And I think there's an argument to be made that it really shouldn't be done very often at all, although that's another video. But if you are going to make a sequel series to something like Avatar, there's obviously a handful of clear directions you could go. What Mike and Brian went with, a show about the new Avatar with Aang's son as her mentor, is a good idea at its core, and there's nothing obviously flawed about such a premise. If anything, the fact that the Avatar reincarnates as a new person with a new personality makes it ideal for creating sequels, since rebooting is tied into the premise of your universe, much like Doctor Who. Therefore, Mike and Brian are already setting themselves up for success. So if that's the case, where are the issues with The Legend of Korra? I think the first and probably the biggest problem with the show is Korra herself. Firstly, because Korra isn't a very good person. She's obnoxious, she's willfully blind to how she's hurting other people, she's entitled and self-centered, and while she has a strong sense that the Avatar is supposed to help the world, she's not very interested in actually trying to make personal self-sacrifices to accomplish these goals.
What is wrong with you?
Now to be fair, we have seen avatars similar to Korra, such as Kuruk in the original series, but Kuruk also lived in a time of peace and wasn't really required to rise to the occasion because there weren't many occasions to rise to, with one notable exception of course. However, Kuruk notwithstanding, Korra seems really at odds with the rest of the Avatar cycle. With Avatar Kyoshi, Roku, and Aang, they were generally extremely good and moral people who justly acted with moral superiority. In the Avatar universe of the original series, the Avatar is depicted as basically a messiah with them as the final arbiter. But with a character like Korra, I struggle to see the supposed inherent goodness we associate with the Avatar. Yes, Korra wants to fight external physical evil, but she has very little inclination towards confronting internal evil with her lack of charity towards her so-called friends and mentors. If anything, it's everyone around her who has to constantly tell her what's good and right, whereas Aang was often the moral guiding force to help resolve conflict and build up his friends. If Korra isn't by nature a more upright and good person than most of the rest of the world, then why is she even the Avatar at all, and why are we following her journey? This seems at odds with the lore and what we know about who the Avatar was always born as at the onset of Legend of Korra. To improve Korra as a person, I think we should have had more scenes of Korra showing some sort of compassion or unselfish thoughtful action towards others. The closest we come to this is Korra sort of stopping her pursuit of Mako partway through the series so he can be with Asami, and Korra trying to treat Asami better in general when she realizes she was being unfair. But this is pretty short-lived since Korra happily ignores Asami's concerns once Mako starts giving her the slightest romantic attention. On the other hand, if you're going to make an Avatar who's a pretty unlikable person like Korra, then you should double down on these character traits and make the show more of a redemption story as she learns to be a great person. The second problem I have with Korra's character is not so much personal as structural. At the outset of the show, within the first 2 or 3 episodes, we're given a Korra who essentially has 4 goals, one of which is to overcome her spiritual ineptitude, which is tied up with her impulsivity, to learn airbending, an element closely tied to spirituality, to date Mako, although this is more implied, and to defeat Amon once Korra becomes aware of his existence. Korra's impulsivity and spiritually lackadaisical attitude aren't terrible starting points. Aang was a spiritual master who took a while to learn the physical elements of the other bending disciplines, whereas Korra is physically skilled and takes a while to figure out the spiritual elements of her role in the world. The characters on the show even point this out within the first 5 minutes of the first episode, which says,
"Ever since you were a little girl, you've excelled at the physical side of bending, but completely ignored the spiritual side."
This contrast is fine, and it lets us explore something new with the Avatar's personality. The fact that Korra is learning airbending is also a really fitting move, since we never really saw Aang learn airbending, as he was already a fully realized master. Korra's trying to become romantically involved with Mako is fine, even if the associated love triangle is played out. And defeating Amon is a good, relatively low-stakes goal, since retreading the world-ending conflict of Avatar would have felt cheap, but making the villain more regional is believable, since it's unreasonable to expect every Avatar to have a world-ending catastrophe, even if I think there were some issues with the implementation. The issue for me is not these 4 goals, so much as the fact that all of them are completed by the end of Season 1. Again, it seems pretty likely that this is related to the fact that Korra was originally written as a miniseries, and with a miniseries you don't want loose ends. But the problem with finishing all your characters' goals in the first season of your show is that there's no legitimate reason for the show to continue. Imagine if Aang had defeated the Fire Lord and mastered all 4 elements in the first season of the show, and then we just had 2 more seasons of Aang traveling the world and solving random conflicts. That's my main problem with The Legend of Korra. Everything after Season 1 feels aimless and it's sometimes forced. Because Amon is defeated in Season 1, the show is forced to provide us with a never-ending litany of big bad villains every single year, which increasingly breaks my suspension of disbelief because of how improbable it is that these random people keep lining up one by one. Although, I have to admit the fact that Zahir and Kuvira are both created as a result of Korra's actions is actually a good move, even if it still seems improbable on a grand scale. The other problem is that there is no clear, personal, overarching goal with Korra after Season 1. The show has to arbitrarily manufacture one. All the progress Korra made curbing her impulsive attitude, well, suddenly that's all gone in Season 2, and Korra has relapsed into a worse person than she was in Season 1. The completely tied-off romance subplot with Mako, well, suddenly their relationship is on the rocks and they have to quickly break up because reasons. Korra's complete reversion as a character is difficult to logically accept as a consequence of everything that came before. Sadly, sequel tropes like this crop up all the time. This is very prevalent when a movie wasn't intended to set up a sequel, and so the sequel has to scramble to put down the protagonist from the societal and emotional high they had in their first outing. Take something like National Treasure, where Ben Gates has restored his family's good name, found his treasure, and he got the girl. Obviously, there's nowhere else Ben's character really needs to go, so for the sequel, they have to break up Ben and Abigail, discredit Ben's family again, and find a new treasure. In this respect, it's just the same movie twice, because when you fulfill everything a character is supposed to do, then everything added on top of that feels like needless padding. Except with The Legend of Korra, 3/4 of the show is needless padding because it kept getting more unnecessary seasons. That's not to say there's nothing redeeming about the later seasons of The Legend of Korra. The return of the style of humor which was prevalent in Avatar was a welcome change. The relationship between Tenzin and his family was nice. But by and large, the decisions made in later seasons just further cheapened the Korra story with unnecessary fan service, the cheapening of how special Tenzin's family is with the arbitrary return of airbending to a bunch of random people, and worst of all to me, the over-explaining of the Avatar mythos, and the over-physicalizing of the power of the Avatar to the point where it's possible to just de-Avatar a person. This is on the same caliber as midichlorians explaining the Force in the Star Wars prequels. Rather than the office of the Avatar being this sacred duty, it's now an arbitrary arrangement with a powerful spirit and a random thief. This is really frustrating. There are some things that for storytelling purposes one just shouldn't explain, and the backstory of the Avatar is one of those, because it greatly cheapens the grandeur and mystery of the Avatar. I never wanted to know who the first Avatar was. I liked that it was just this seemingly infinite chain of heroes who were divinely ordained to protect the world. Sometimes you just want something to be fully realized because it's more fun that way. Those are the big pragmatic reasons why I think The Legend of Korra should have stopped at Season 1, But there are, of course, a lot of problematic elements that could have been improved on even if Season 1 had stayed as a miniseries. First, let's talk about the Ensemble Cast. While all of these characters are fine, and frankly I enjoyed them a lot more during this rewatch, sometimes they feel redundant and like pale imitations of characters from a much better show like Avatar. Mako is the brooding firebender like Zuko was, but his backstory is so commonplace and fantasy that we don't really care about it, and it doesn't help that there's no flashback or actual connection to his parents' death. Lin is fine, but kind of boring and not really an I'm in every episode material type character. Bolin is supposed to be an analog for Sokka, the comic relief character, except Bolin's not actually that funny, although he's a great person and a welcome presence on the show. I did find Tenzin and his family vibrant and specific people with clear characterization, no matter how long or short their time is on screen.
Mommy, look! I'm a spellbender!
Were Tenzin and his siblings this crazy when they were kids?
Kaya and Bumi certainly were, but Tenzin has always been rather serious.
Mother, please.
Also, I really liked Asami a lot more in rewatching the show. This time around she feels a lot less like background and more interesting as a person. Honestly, both her and Bolin deserve way better than how Korra and Mako treat them in Season 1. I felt like laughing when Mako turned to Korra and said,
"You're the most loyal, brave, and selfless person I've ever known."
Like, come on, Mako, what show are you watching? I think the whole ensemble of this show could have been improved if we spent more time getting to know them. Korra is the only character on the show who we see as a child, but with Tenzin, Lin, Mako, Bolin, and Asami, all of their backstory is told solely through dialogue. While I'm a guy who likes exposition way more than I should as a filmmaker, I can't deny that there's a real benefit to showing instead of, or in addition to, telling the audience about a character. Consider the turning point for Avatar in Season 1 called The Storm, where we spend some time learning about the failings and struggles of our main hero and villain by seeing them via flashback. Nothing like this really happens for any of the heroes in The Legend of Korra. The closest we get is the penultimate episode of Season 1 of Korra, where Tarlok shows the relationship of himself and his brother and his father. And I'm not saying we necessarily need more flashbacks specifically, but we need more personalization and better emotional ties to the motivations of our characters. If I could pick just one character who I think needed more time spent with the spotlight on them, it would probably be Asami. Her character is probably the most promising to me because she's the only main member of the team who's not a bender in a story that heavily features the theme of bending and non-bending. How does Asami feel about the revolution her father has devoted so much time to? Obviously she thinks it's bad, but why does she think it's bad? Just because of her boyfriend and because she likes pro-bending? Honestly, with the way Mako just kind of sidelines her after she gave up everything to help Team Avatar, it's kind of surprising Asami doesn't turn evil even a little bit, and it shows a much stronger character than Korra has. Asami actually highlights a bigger problem with the whole bender versus non-bender conflict on the show. We only see the extremes of the movement from both sides, with those for bending,
Bending is the coolest thing in the world!
and those vehemently against.
This is what's wrong with the city! Benders like this girl only use their power to oppress us!
We thought we were getting a middle ground character with the informant who tips off Team Avatar to Hiroshi Sato's evil plan, but then it turns out the informant was working for Hiroshi the whole time, which scuttles that idea. If you're going to do a complex political conflict, I don't think it's too much to ask for shades of uncertainty among the ranks. After all, Avatar was able to do this with a far less ambiguous conflict aimed at children. As for villains on the show, I don't really have anything very interesting to say. I already mentioned how I liked the flashback episode with Tarlok and Amon, but honestly this feels like it needed to come way earlier, because while Tarlok is serviceable, Amon is just a complete blank slate as a character throughout the entire show until the last 20 minutes. It's fine if you have a character who's just masked and menacing like Darth Vader, but at least Darth Vader showed some emotions even before we knew his backstory. Granted, that emotion was primarily anger, but at least it's something. There is Amon's delivery of his fake backstory in episode 3, but honestly, who cares because it's not that convincing and it turns out to be nonsense anyway. Amon does have a great sense of menace though, and the fact that he kicks so much butt and scares the crap out of Korra all the time, who values her identity as the Avatar represented by her bending above everything, is definitely a plus. That said, Amon's ability to just arbitrarily remove bending is weird. I guess it's not totally unprecedented since chi blocking is presumably cutting off some sort of muscle or blood movement which causes bending, But if that's the case, then Korra's ability to energy bend seems like it would have no effect or healing power on those affected, because it comes from a different source. Also, how did Korra restoring the bending of those who were affected by Amon even work, like, logistically? Did she set up a booth at the police station and put out flyers? Did she give Tano back his bending or tell him to step off? Korra deciding who deserves to have their bending back seems like it would have been an interesting scene if we absolutely had to have a season 2. Certainly, it would have been more interesting to watch than Korra whining to everyone who loves her about how hard it is to be the most powerful and respected person on the planet. Alright, having talked about characters and characterization, I want to talk about setting. To put it simply, I don't like it. The whole steampunk retro future 20s thing we've got going on in Republic City doesn't work for me. In Avatar, technology existed and sometimes played an important role, but that was usually limited to vehicles, and it was hardly the most interesting parts of the story. At times it even felt like it was a little out of place in the world of Avatar. In The Legend of Korra, it's almost like Mike and Brian are trying to drown the audience in vintage technology and fashion that they're really into. Suddenly this universe has flashlights, radios, cars, plastic surgery, biplanes, electric fences, tasers, and scoreboards. Is it logically possible that over the course of 7 decades these sorts of things could have come to be? Yes, but whether fair or not, I still find it jarring how front and center the show places these things. I understand that technology has to be part of the story for the idea of non-benders rising up to have any menace to it, but it's still annoying. This might be my least fair criticism, and maybe I don't have very much basis for it, but it always irks me whenever I watch the show. Not because I dislike the 20s, but because pushing the 20s into the Avatar universe is just visually off-putting. The other issue I have with Republic City is that it's ultimately kind of boring. The city is drab and brown, and after a couple of episodes there, you're ready to move on. To the show's credit, the later, entirely unnecessary seasons rectify this by trying to reintroduce some travel into the story akin to Avatar, but it comes too little too late. In Avatar, we spent significant time in Ba Sing Se, but it was only for a couple of episodes, after which the show moved on. If we had spent, say, the entirety of Season 2 of Avatar in one city, I think the show would have really suffered because of it. Also, as far as extremely nitpicky things, Korra was taught to waterbend by Katara, which she says, why doesn't she break out of her cage by bending her sweat like Katara did before her? She could waterbend slices through the metal weave above her. These kinds of nitpicks just never come up in Avatar because Mike and Brian were better about covering their bases, but littler things like this in The Legend of Korra just seem lazy. Alright, I've complained about this show enough. Time to say some of the things I'm a fan of. While I generally didn't like the aesthetic of The Legend of Korra, I did like the preservation of the national color scheme, even in the melting pot of Republic City. It's interesting visually and fascinating pragmatically that people who bend different elements or hail from different nations would willingly telegraph that fact. Even brothers happily show their respective bending colors. It's just kind of a fun decision. While most of the humor in Legend of Korra Season 1 doesn't work, I liked this joke a lot.
It's alright, Toza. She's with me.
Yeah, I'm with him.
So, you see, we're together.
Well, not together, more like friends.
Right, friends. No, I didn't mean to imply...
Oh, you implied it.
Also, Pema's expression after she nopes out at the teenage drama stuff between Mako and Asami is priceless. The music in The Legend of Korra is also better than in Avatar. Granted, it's basically just copying some of its score from Avatar, but Jeremy Zuckerman really outdid himself and produced some great themes. Also, I love how the music where Korra is running out into the snow at the start of the show full of happiness is the same theme they play when she's depressed and sad in the same location at the end of the season. The animation is also really good, even if design-wise I don't like how it leaned harder into anime than did The Last Airbender. Also, in the final episode of Season 1, the moment where Tarlok kills Amon is simply great and bittersweet. It's especially poignant because we saw 10 minutes ago that Amon can sense where people are without needing to see them. So, as others have pointed out, it's entirely possible that he's crying because he knows what Tarlok is doing and doesn't want to stop him. In fact, both the first 2 episodes of the show and the final one are all good, and I found that I've rewatched them more often than any of the others over the past several years. Despite all these positives, the fact is that when I'm watching something that's really good, like Avatar, I don't have to convince myself to like it. Some things are proficiently made even if I don't enjoy them, like Citizen Kane, and some things are just obviously good and enjoyable to a wide group of people, like an Empire Strikes Back or a Shazam. The Legend of Korra is neither of these, and that's kind of a bummer, all things considered. I don't know who's at fault or why this show didn't work as well as Avatar, and I don't want to point fingers. But judging The Legend of Korra based on what was ultimately produced, I can't help but think it would have been improved with another couple looks at some of the structural elements and character decisions, as well as finishing the show on a high note with the beautiful end to Korra's arc instead of dragging the show along with needless repetition.